This would be a good time once more to stop and reflect on the scope of what we have learned. One of the most difficult parts of this entire narrative is its prosaic nature. The implications are huge, but the history is anything but heroic or sublime. Part of the world that we were raised with in the West is the tendency to create the superlatives and the absolutes, the highest and the best, and the lowest or the worst. If we were to ask those who have studied the building of narratives in human culture, such as Dr. Jordan Peterson, the response would be that this tendency is quite normal, and an intrinsic part of a developing self-awareness, the self-consciousness that separates us as human beings from all other biological-based sentient beings on Earth. This may be so, but what it has done, in our opinion, is distort the actual truth of history itself. Now, we may want to say that such a distortion is harmless, in and of itself. However, when it becomes embedded into consciousness on a very wide scale, and further narratives are predicated and built upon it, sooner or later there is a challenge. And sooner or later there is a battle. Our nature being what it is, these battles often extend beyond the halls of academia and into the streets. The embedded memes, as we call them today, are powerful enough to lead to war within nations and with other nations. In short, people have died throughout history for the distortions of that history. That is why it is risky in one sense to bring it back to the front today. But it is necessary if we are to do what so many say that they want the human race to do. And that is to move on and up to a higher and better form of civilization. And yet, there is also a very good reason that we as human beings need a narrative structure. It is at the very essence of our consciousness to establish a form and put being into it. It is the act of creation itself. We remember what the scripture in Genesis told us of the origins of the world we live in. It was without form and void. It required form to be anything other than chaos, and later we see that echoed in the New Testament Gospel of John, where he says that in the beginning was the Word. What is being taught is that the form is the Word and the Word is form. This is the way that creation happens. Again, as Jordan Peterson points out, word and thought and idea are the same. That is why the scripture talks of the world being spoken into existence. This is an excellent commentary on how we as human beings understand the world. In computer terminology, this is the operating system of the human consciousness. It is the reason why the idealists were anxious to explain the world chronologically from form, the ideal, to the manifestation of that form. But we know that nothing that is not created by human beings actually follows the ideal in the instance. We are capable of making things that are uniform. But the reality there is that with a high enough resolution examination, our uniform creations are not identical at all. This is the tension that exists in the world and the human mind between chaos and order, that the Taoists have taught for a very long time. It parallels the human experience of emotion and reason. And the truth is that neither is of any use without the other. Here we have dipped our toes into a very large pool. There is a further wealth of understanding just in the attempt to explain our own consciousness. The explanation for that consciousness is what is known as the big problem. The short answer is that we are beings with the consciousness of our creators, the Anunnaki. That doesn't explain consciousness itself, but it moves the philosophical problem into another sphere where it might be more manageable. There is an interesting parallel here when we consult the ancient accounts and compare that with the Bible. In its conflation of the tales that the descendants of Abraham carried out of that ancient Sumerian civilization, the Bible in Genesis tells us that God, the one God, punished Adam and Eve for the attainment of that self-knowledge, that self-consciousness. However, the truth is that Enki, the mastermind behind the human race, the Adamu, was the one that caused us to have that consciousness through the infusion of Anunnaki DNA, and it was his brother Enlil that expelled Adam and Eve from the garden when he realized what had happened. This essentially had transformed Adamu from animal to a being equal in self-awareness to the Anunnaki. You shall be like the gods, knowing good and evil. It would seem that Enlil was fine with using the human race as mind slaves and gardening slaves in Eden, as long as they were animals, like horses or oxen. However, when they became self-aware beings, his conscience would not allow him to have those beings near him. He planned their destruction from that point on. His word to Enki was that they should never have created human beings in the first place. Perhaps that is true. The history of planet Earth was forever changed. That is certain. and we can recognize in ourselves the way that we hate and wish to destroy those we have wronged. And in this instance, in this narrative, we see one of those errors that we spoke of earlier. Here, the narrative was conflated from the gods to the one God, and in doing so, this one God had to be all-wise and all-good and offended at the sin of the human race. And the God that had done the actual genetic modification was henceforth known as the devil, the serpent. The polarity and enmity between the brothers was transmuted into the eventual polarity of good and evil, which we have with us to this very day. This good versus evil paradigm has become universal in the Western world, regardless of the many variations in the religious or philosophical structure that surrounds it. It is a cultural meme that goes so deep it cannot even be questioned. And, as one example of how such a meme can be turned to destruction and a caricature of the paradigm that underlies it, we see the West for the most recent half-century using military force and economic force to compel nations and cultures to bend the knee to an ethic and social order that is deemed to be good and superior. And we see those who religiously support this policy seem quite oblivious to the evil being done, by their own standard of evil, in the name of the good they profess. But that is a side issue to the bigger question. We all know the hypocrisy of our time, as much as we can see that hypocrisy manifests in history as well. But from this we can draw a conclusion. The good and evil paradigm, and the attendant narrative of Christianity, regardless of its flavor, seems to be inadequate to the task it has set before it. Clearly it does not claim to turn the entire world to the good, but rather to be the salvation of some souls from the power of evil, the pathway for the elect. But it seems even those elect will not act consistently for the good and will visit evil upon those it deems unworthy or non-compliant. So what then is the purpose and point? Once again we must pause, reflect on this, and perhaps ask the question, how did this monotheism come about to begin with? And, the further question, why is there an amalgamation, a fusion of the concept of the creator of the universe and the concept of the creators of mankind? The first has not been addressed in all the accounts that we have that were passed down from and about the Anunnaki. We know that when Enki first proposed the creation of Adamu, one of the objections raised was that it was forbidden to create life. Who did the forbidding? Was this a prohibition that came as a result of foresight as technology advanced, or was this a result of past negative experience? We have an account from the Anunnaki of the forming of our solar system and the events that occurred when Nibiru first came through and encountered the Earth. But as to the origins of the universe itself, to date there is no real explanation. We are of the opinion that the transition from the Anunnaki gods and the subsequent Pantheon mythologies to monotheism was not organic but was done with a purpose. This, of course, was not universal across the world. Nevertheless, where it occurred it appears deliberate. The rise of monotheism seems to coincide, or at least runs parallel to the timeline of the departure of the Anunnaki. That departure in and of itself raises some interesting questions about Anunnaki intentions regarding humanity. There is some indication, but what amount of responsibility do they feel obliged to carry for the future of mankind? What do they know or suspect about the future of planet Earth itself? Let us ponder some of these questions until we return.